Once upon a time in a small village, there lived a young man named Kwabena. He was known for his handsome features, tall and lean with a broad chest and kind eyes that reflected the strength of his heart. Despite his charm, life had been far from kind to him. His parents had passed away when he was just 18 years old, leaving him to care for his younger sister, Ajoa, who was only 11 at the time. Without their parents, the two were left to the mercy of their relatives. Unfortunately, the family members who took them in treated them poorly, forcing Kwabena to drop out of school and fend for himself and his sister. They were given little food, often left to do hard labor around the house, and were spoken to harshly. Life became unbearable, and after a few years of enduring the mistreatment, Kwabena decided it was time to leave. He rented a small room for himself and Ajoa, and, with no other options, he became a taxi driver in the nearby town. At just 22 years old, Kwabena had become both mother and father to Ajoa, who was now 15. Every day, he drove his taxi in the bustling streets of the nearby town, working till night. It was exhausting work, but he had no choice. Ajoa, determined to help, would sell oranges on the streets after school. Though Kwabena hated seeing her work so hard, they both knew that they needed the extra money to survive. But some days, the weight of their struggles felt too heavy, but they refused to give up. They knew they had to fight for each other and see Ajoa finish school and live the life he never had, a life full of opportunities, free from the shackles of poverty. And then, slowly, things began to turn around. Kwabena's taxi business started to pick up. He worked long hours, often driving from dawn until well past dusk, but it was worth it. With every fare, he was able to save a little more money, and before long, he had enough to make a real difference in their lives. "We've made it this far, Ajoa," Kwabena would say to her, his eyes filled with hope. "I want you to focus on your studies now. No more selling oranges. Your education is what's going to lift us out of this." For the first time in years, they were living a somewhat happy life. Kwabena saved every cedi he earned, determined to give Ajoa the life he never had. He dreamed of sending her to university, where she could study and become someone important, and nothing was going to stop him from seeing that dream come true. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. One afternoon, as Kwabena was making his usual rounds through the bustling market square, he spotted a familiar face, Akosua. His heart skipped a beat. Akosua had been his high school sweetheart, the girl who had made his heart race back when life was simpler. She was still as beautiful as ever, her long braids cascading down her back, her dark eyes shining with the same mischief he remembered. "Akosua," he called out, pulling his taxi to a stop. "Is that really you?" She turned around, and when her eyes met his, a wide smile spread across her face. "Kwabena, I can't believe it's you. It's been so long." Kwabena got out of his taxi, feeling a rush of emotions flood back. "It really has. How have you been?" "I've been good," Akosua replied, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "I'm in nursing school now in the city. I just came home to visit my family. And you? What are you doing these days?" Kwabena's smile faltered for a moment. "I'm driving a taxi now. Had to drop out of school when my parents passed." Akosua's expression softened. "Oh, Kwabena, I'm so sorry. I didn't know," he shrugged, trying to keep his voice light. "It's all right. I'm doing fine now. Things are looking up for me and Ajoa." They stood there, talking for what felt like hours, reminiscing about their school days and all the dreams they used to have. Eventually, they exchanged numbers, promising to stay in touch. In the weeks that followed, Kwabena and Akosua grew closer. They began texting each other constantly, then meeting up whenever Akosua came back to the village. Before long, they were officially dating again, and Kwabena couldn't have been happier. He felt like everything in his life was finally falling into place. But what Kwabena didn't know was that Akosua had a secret. While she enjoyed the attention and care Kwabena showered on her, she was also involved with another man, a student in a university in the city. When Akosua visited the village, she was careful to cover her tracks. She asked Kwabena to drop her off a few blocks away from her university whenever he gave her a ride back, claiming she didn't want her friends to see her getting out of a taxi. She became more protective of her phone, constantly making excuses to step outside when she got a call. Kwabena noticed the changes, But his love for Akosua blinded him to the truth. He convinced himself that she was just stressed from school, and that all these calls might be school-related, and that everything was fine. One day, while Kwabena was driving his taxi, his phone rang. It was Akosua, and her voice was trembling with tears. "Kwabena, I don't know what to do," she sobbed. Kwabena's heart tightened in his chest. "Akosua, what's wrong? Are you all right?" "No, I'm not. My mother can't afford to pay my school and hostel fees anymore, and I might have to drop out of school. I really don't want to drop out. Please help me," she cried. Kwabena's heart sank. The thought of Akosua losing her chance at an education, at a better life, filled him with dread. He had worked so hard to keep Ajoa in school, and now the woman he loved was facing the same fate he had fought so hard to avoid. "Don't worry, Akosua," he said softly, trying to calm her. "I'll figure something out. Just give me until tomorrow, all right?" "Thank you, Kwabena," she whispered through her tears. "I knew I could count on you." That night, Kwabena lay awake, his mind racing. He had saved up a good amount of money, enough to send Ajoa to university soon. But now, Akosua needed him. He was torn between the two most important women in his life. On one hand, he had promised himself that he would give Ajoa the future he never had. On the other hand, if he helped Akosua now, maybe she would become a nurse and they could build a life together from her money she will be receiving. As dawn approached, Kwabena made his decision. He would help Akosua. He told himself. It was an investment in their future. Once she became successful, they would both be better off, and Ajoa's time would come soon enough. The next morning, Kwabena drove to the city. He rented an apartment for Akosua, took her shopping for groceries and other supplies, paid her school and hostel fees in full. He spent every last cedi of his savings, but as he watched the smile on Akosua's face, he convinced himself that it was worth it. "Thank you so much, Kwabena," Akosua said, hugging him tightly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Kwabena smiled, though his heart ached from the sacrifice he had just made. "Anything for you, Akosua. We're in this together, right?" "Right," she said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. As soon as Kwabena left, Akosua wasted no time calling her university boyfriend. He arrived at her new apartment within the hour, and together they laughed about how easily Kwabena had been fooled. "I can't believe he actually paid for everything," Akosua said, shaking her head as she lounged on the couch. Her boyfriend, Kwame, laughed, putting his arm around her shoulders. "That guy is such a fool," Kwame said, snickering. "Does he really think you'll end up with him? A taxi driver? Please." Akosua giggled, leaning into Kwame's embrace. "Well, he's useful for now. I mean, he's the one paying for everything. Why should I say no?" Kwame shrugged, smirking. "As long as you know what you're doing, just don't let him get too comfortable." "Oh, don't worry," Akosua replied. "He is madly in love with me and won't suspect a thing. I'll just keep him around until I don't need him anymore." They both laughed, unaware that their callous words would soon come back to haunt them. As the months passed, Kwabena threw himself into his work with renewed energy. But his love for Akosua blinded him to the warning signs, the secretive phone calls, the vague excuses about why she couldn't see him as often, the way she distanced herself emotionally, except when she needed something from him, but will always shake of the thought. After all, he knows he's making an investment in his woman. Whenever Akosua visited him or asked for more money, Kwabena would remind himself that he was building a future for both of them. But even as he held on to that hope, Kwabena noticed subtle changes in Akosua's behavior. She no longer seemed excited to see him when he visited. She avoided spending too much time with him, and every time they were together, her eyes were always glued to her phone, or she seemed distracted. Things only got worse as time went on. Ajoa had finally started university, the same one where Kwame was studying. Kwabena had enrolled her there so that he could visit her easily whenever he came to see Akosua. However, the moment Akosua learned of this, she became furious. "Kwabena, why did you send your sister to that university?" Akosua snapped during one of her visits home. "You should have sent her somewhere else." Kwabena frowned, surprised by her outburst. "Why would I do that? It's a good school and it's close to where you are. I thought it would be convenient for all of us." Akosua crossed her arms, her face dark with anger. "No, it's not convenient and you didn't think to share that with me first. I don't want her there," She'll just get in the way." "In the way of what?" Kwabena asked, his voice rising. "Ajoa is my sister. She's there to get an education, not to interfere with anyone." Akosua avoided his gaze, her frustration palpable. "I just don't want her there, Kwabena, trying to avoid suspicion." They argued for hours, the tension between them building until Akosua finally relented, though she was far from happy. Kwabena couldn't understand why Akosua was so upset, but he dismissed it, believing that things would settle down once they had cooled off. But they didn't. As the months dragged on, Akosua became colder and more distant, only showing affection when she needed something. Her demands grew larger, and Kwabena found himself depleting every last cedi he had. He even went as far as selling his taxi, the very thing that had been their lifeline for years, to fund her increasingly extravagant lifestyle. One day, as Kwabena sat down for dinner with Ajoa, she finally voiced her concern. "Kwabena, I don't understand why you're doing all of this," Ajoa said, her voice soft but filled with worry. "Why are you giving so much to Akosua? You're selling everything you've worked for, even your taxi. What about your future? What about us?" Kwabena sighed deeply, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Ajoa, I'm investing in her because I love her. She's going to be successful, and when she is, she'll help us. She'll help me, and we'll build a life together." Ajoa frowned, her brow furrowing in concern. "But Kwabena, what if she doesn't? What if she doesn't come through for you? You've already done so much for her. Don't you think it's time to think about yourself and your future?" Kwabena's heart ached. He didn't want to believe that Akosua would betray him. He had sacrificed so much for her. But Ajoa's words lingered in his mind, planting seeds of doubt he could no longer ignore. Kwabena funded Akosua, still she graduated and still used the money he has been saving to have a better and high-earning hospital for Akosua to work. But Akosua's attitude never changed. Kwabena decided to surprise her with some flowers in her apartment and take her to dinner later. The next day, after dropping Ajoa off at university, Kwabena decided to pay Akosua a surprise visit as planned. When he arrived at her apartment, his heart pounded in his chest as he knocked on the door. There was no answer. Frowning, Kwabena knocked again, this time louder. He could hear faint voices inside. Akosua's laughter mingled with a man's voice. Something inside him broke. He tried the door handle, and to his surprise, it was unlocked. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his heart racing. What he saw shattered him. Akosua and Kwame were sitting together on the couch, their hands entwined and laying on each other. They didn't notice him at first, too lost in their laughter. But when Akosua finally looked up and saw Kwabena standing there, her smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock and guilt. "Kwabena," she stammered, pulling her hand away from Kwame's. It's not what it looks like." Kwabena stood frozen in place, his world crumbling around him. His voice caught in his throat, and all he could do was stare at the woman he had given everything to, realizing that it had all been a lie. Kwame smirked, unfazed by Kwabena's presence. "Come on, Akosua. Don't lie to him. It's exactly what it looks like. And do you think I'm that dumb? You can go after all, or you were thinking I was going to end up with a common taxi driver like you? God forbid. I know my man is going to make it big time, so you can start leaving," Akosua said, laughing. Tears welled up in Kwabena's eyes as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. He had given everything, his time, his money, his dreams, for a woman who had never truly loved him. Without saying another word, Kwabena turned and walked out of the apartment. He didn't want to hear any more of their excuses or lies. His heart was too broken, his spirit too crushed. The following weeks were some of the hardest of Kwabena's life. He had lost everything, his savings, his taxi, and the future he had imagined for himself and Akosua. Was he really blinded by love to the extent that he spent his life saving on Akosua? Ajoa encouraged him to stay strong and start working again. It's going to pay off, and Akosua is definitely going to regret her decision. With a little money left, he had to rent a friend's car just to continue working as a taxi driver, but business was slow and every day felt like a struggle. He felt like a failure, like he had let his sister down and destroyed their dreams. But despite the overwhelming despair, Kwabena refused to give up. He was determined to rebuild his life, no matter how long it took. He threw himself back into his work, driving tirelessly from morning till night, saving every penny he earned. Slowly but surely he began to recover, regaining some of the strength and resilience that had once defined him. One day, while driving through the city, Kwabena picked up a well-dressed woman in his taxi. She looked elegant and wealthy, with a graceful demeanor that instantly caught his attention. As they drove, she accidentally left purse on the back seat when she stepped out. Realizing the mistake, Kwabena looked inside the purse for identification and found her address. Without hesitation, he drove to her house to return the purse. When the woman opened the door, she looked surprised to see him. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Kwabena said politely. "You left this in my taxi." The woman's face lit up with gratitude. "Oh my goodness. I didn't even realize. Thank you so much." Kwabena handed her the purse, and she smiled warmly. "You're a good man. Most people wouldn't have gone out of their way to return this." The woman looked at him curiously. "Tell me, what do you do, besides driving taxis, I mean?" Kwabena hesitated before replying. "I'm just a taxi driver, ma'am. I'm just a taxi driver, ma'am," Kwabena said, his voice soft, eyes downcast. "I used to have my own car, but things got tough, and now I rent one from a friend." The woman, whose name was Mrs. Hammond, tilted her head, sensing there was more to his story. "You don't seem like just a taxi driver to me," she said kindly. "I believe there's more to you than that. Would you like to tell me your story?" Kwabena hesitated, unsure if he should burden her with his past, but there was something in her eyes, a warmth that made him feel safe, as if she truly wanted to listen. So he told her everything: the death of his parents, how he had to drop out of school to care for his younger sister, Ajoa, and how he had worked as a taxi driver to support her education. He spoke of Akosua, the love he had invested in, only to have his heart shattered when he discovered her betrayal. He explained how he had sold everything, including his taxi, to fund her lifestyle, thinking they would build a future together, only to be left with nothing. As he spoke, Mrs. Hammond listened attentively, her expression sympathetic but thoughtful. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of his words. "You've been through so much," she finally said, her voice gentle. "But you're not a failure, Kwabena. You have a good heart. You sacrificed for love, and though it didn't turn out the way you hoped, that doesn't make you weak. It shows your strength." Kwabena looked up, surprised by her words. "But I lost everything," he said quietly. "I don't even have enough money to support my sister properly anymore." Mrs. Hammond smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "It's not about what you've lost, it's about what you can still build. And I believe you have the potential to do so much more than drive a taxi." She paused for a moment, then continued, "Actually, I've been looking for a driver, someone trustworthy to drive my daughter around. She's had a rough time lately, and I need someone who can be dependable and kind. From what I've heard of your story, you're exactly the kind of person I'm looking for. Would you be interested?" Kwabena blinked, surprised by her offer. "You'd really give me that chance?" Mrs. Hammond nodded. "Yes, I would. It's more than just driving. It's about being there for someone who needs support. My daughter, Amma, has been going through a difficult period in her life, and I want someone who can look out for her. I believe you could be that person." Kwabena felt a spark of hope ignite inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "I would be honored, ma'am," he said sincerely. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity." Mrs. Hammond smiled warmly. "You deserve it, Kwabena. You've earned it." The next week, Kwabena began his new job as Amma's personal driver. Amma, Mrs. Hammond's daughter, was a young woman in her early 20s, quiet and reserved at first, but as the days passed, they slowly began to grow closer. She was going through her own struggles, a recent breakup with a man who had treated her poorly, leaving her heartbroken and disillusioned. Kwabena could relate to her pain, and though they didn't talk about it at first, there was a shared understanding between them. One evening, after picking Amma up from an event, Kwabena noticed that she seemed unusually upset. Her eyes were red, and she was wiping away tears as she got into the car. "Are you okay, Amma?" Kwabena asked gently as he started driving. She sniffed and looked away, trying to compose herself. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled. Kwabena didn't push her, but after a few minutes of silence, Amma suddenly spoke up. "It's just, I saw him tonight. My ex. He was with another woman, and they looked so happy. I don't know why it bothers me so much. I know he wasn't good for me, but it still hurts." Kwabena glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his heart aching for her. "I know how you feel," he said softly. "It's hard to let go of someone, even when they've hurt you. But it's not your fault, Amma. You deserve better." Amma looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Kwabena replied firmly. "You're strong, and you deserve someone who will love and respect you. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not worthy of that." Amma smiled faintly, her expression softening. "Thank you, Kwabena. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that." From that moment on, their bond deepened. Amma confided in Kwabena more and more, and in turn, he shared pieces of his own life with her, his struggles, his dreams, and the lessons he had learned through his heartbreak. They became each other's source of comfort, and over time, Amma began to lean on him not just as her driver, but as a friend. A few weeks later, Kwabena found himself in the city, picking up a fare. It was an ordinary day, or so he thought, until he pulled up to a familiar figure standing on the corner. His heart skipped a beat when he realized who it was, Akosua. She looked different, worn down by time and perhaps by the consequences of her choices. Akosua's eyes widened when she saw him, and for a moment they just stared at each other, the weight of their shared past heavy in the air. Slowly she approached the car, her once confident demeanor now replaced by something more fragile. "Kwabena," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time." Kwabena didn't respond immediately. His mind flashed back to the day he had discovered her betrayal, the day he had walked away, heartbroken and defeated. He had invested everything he had in her, only to be left with nothing. "What do you want, Akosua?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. She bit her lip, looking down at the ground. "I'm sorry, Kwabena, for everything. I made so many mistakes. I thought I could have it all, but I ended up with nothing. The guy I left you for, he used me, then abandoned me. I lost everything." Kwabena stared at her, his emotions conflicted. "You made your choices, Akosua," he said quietly, "and I made mine. I've moved on." Tears filled Akosua's eyes, and she stepped closer to the car. "Please, Kwabena, I know I don't deserve it, but I need help. I've hit rock bottom, and I don't know where else to turn." Kwabena shook his head. "I'm not the man you used to know, Akosua. I've learned a lot since then, and I've found someone who truly cares about me. I can't go back to that life." Akosua's face crumpled, and she let out a sob. "Please, Kwabena, I was wrong. I see that now. I just want another chance." Kwabena's heart ached for her, but he knew better now. He had given her everything once, and she had thrown it away. "I wish you the best, Akosua," he said firmly, "but I've found happiness now. I hope you can do the same." Without another word, he drove away, leaving Akosua standing on the corner, her past mistakes haunting her. As he pulled away, he felt a sense of closure wash over him. He had finally let go of the pain she had caused, and now he could focus on the future he was building with Amma. One night, after thinking thoroughly, Kwabena stood nervously in the living room, his hands slightly trembling as he faced Amma. The soft glow of the evening light filtered through the window, casting a warm hue over their faces. "Amma," he began, his voice low but full of emotion, "I've loved you for as long as I can remember. I want to build a life with you, no matter the challenges. Will you be mine?" Amma smiled, her eyes softening with affection. "I love you too, Kwabena. Yes, I'll be yours," she said, her heart swelling with joy. Later, they sat down with Amma's mother, who listened carefully to Kwabena's hopes and concerns about supporting his sister and his future wife. With a thoughtful nod, Amma's mother smiled. "Kwabena, I admire your sincerity and hard work. I'm willing to help you start a better job so you can take care of both your sister and Amma." Kwabena's heart swelled with a mix of relief and warmth. He hadn't expected this, but now that it was happening, he couldn't deny the feelings that had quietly grown between them. Maybe this was his second chance at love, and maybe this time it wouldn't break him. He squeezed her hand back, his heart pounding. "Let's take things slow, Amma. I'm willing to try if you are." Amma beamed through her tears, nodding. "That's all I ask.